Hello and welcome to India Reads. I am Pradeep, and you are looking at my lockdown hairstyle, which will continue to be there for some more time. We are currently reading The Accidental Prime Minister. We are in chapter number 9, the Manmohan Singh Doctrine. So let's start. India is destined to recover its due status in the world, but this process will be speeded up if we do what we must at home and build bridges of mutual interdependence with the world. Manmohan Singh at the India Today conclave, February 2005. Let's start. Whenever he wanted to draw attention to the limits of central government, in particular prime ministerial power, Dr. Singh would quote Telugu Desam founder leader N.T. Ramarao's famous remark that the center is a conceptual myth. The Indian constitution defines the powers of the center and the states, but the balance between them has shifted from time to time depending on the nature of political dispensation. India has gone through both centralizing and decentralizing phases with prime ministerial power waxing and waning. While in times of crisis or an emergency, including the economic crisis, war, and natural disasters, the central government can mobilize and deploy its power in ways that override the power of the states. In normal times, the central center's real power derives only from its control over the fiscal resources and the security and intelligence apparatus. Even then, a prime minister is constrained by the cabinet form of government, in which is at best a first among equals. Coalition governments impose further restrictions on prime ministerial authority. In the case of the UPA, the PM's authority was further curbed by the nature of the power sharing between the Congress party and the PM. For all these reasons, and given the economy was in reasonably good shape in 2004 and that there were no major challenge on the military side, Dr. Singh decided to focus his attention on foreign policy. This was one area in which the prime ministerial prerogative was paramount. The external affairs minister does not have the kind of freedom of action that a finance, home, or defense minister can hope to enjoy even in normal times. That is in part because most foreign policy initiatives flower at the level of the head of government or head of state. Dr. Singh's only problem in choosing foreign policy as an area where he put his stamp was that his external affairs minister was a retired diplomat with a mind of his own. Natwar Singh not only had clear views on foreign policy issues but also believed that Dr. Singh was a political greenhorn and a novice in foreign affairs. He also assumed that his long standing proximity to the Nehru Gandhi family placed him a peg above Dr. Singh in the dynasty based Congress party's nebulous hierarchy. However, Sonia Gandhi never allowed one person to assume that he or she was the last word on any issue. During her journey to power, she turned to a range of partymen, including Karan Singh, Mani Shankar Iyer, and Mani Dixit for foreign policy advice, even though it was Natwar Singh and sometimes Dr. Singh who would accompany her to meetings with visiting heads of government. Similarly, on economic policy side, her key aide was always Dr. Singh, but she would lend her ear to Pranab Mukherjee and P. Chidambaram, among others. In the end, Natwar Singh, who lasted about 18 months as External Affairs Minister, proved to be supportive of the PM than we assumed he would be, more supportive of the PM than we assumed he would be. But the PM also had to make a conscious and determined effort to befriend Natwar and at the same time exert his authority. The episode reported earlier in which Natwar Singh exceeded his brief on the matter of India sending troops to Iraq offered Mani Dixit a good opportunity to assert the PMO's role in foreign policy. A second, if less important opportunity for the PM to assert his individual authority overriding diplomatic advice was provided a few days later when Ronald Reagan died. Dr. Singh wanted to go to Roosevelt House, home of US Ambassador, and sign the condolence book as a gesture of regard to the late president and goodwill towards the US. Reagan was generous in his dealings with both Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi, but the Foreign Service officers in the PMO advised him against going to the ambassador's house and said condolence book would be brought to him. Noticing that Dr. Singh was torn about whether he should follow his own instincts or the advice of his diplomats, I reminded him of how Jawaharlal Nehru would at times drive down to see John Kenneth Gabriel at the Roosevelt House just for a cup of coffee and quiet conversation. In fact, Robert Black was the US ambassador in Delhi. When Robert Black was the US ambassador in Delhi, he would visit his visitors down for coffee in the far right corner of the living room, saying, "Let's have coffee," where Nehru and Gabriel used to. Dr. Singh decided that he would go to Roosevelt House and sign the condolence book. On his way home for lunch from Parliament, his car kid took a detour and drove there at short notice, surprising everyone. Slowly but steadily, Dr. Singh began to assert himself in the field of foreign affairs and policy. He mostly conceded limits to his authority in shaping domestic policy, given that his council of ministers had loyalties to other centers of political power. But he jealously guarded the foreign policy turf and ensured his writ would run at least in this sphere. In September 2004, when he traveled to New York to address the UN General Assembly, he was firmly in the saddle. Dr. Singh was, of course, not a novice in foreign affairs. As Secretary General of the South Commission based in Geneva, he had the opportunity to deal with world leaders and familiarize himself with world affairs. As Finance Minister in the early 1990s, he engaged actively in economic diplomacy to strengthen India's external economic profile, taking charge as India's Finance Minister in the midst of a major external payment crisis at the end of the Cold War. Dr. Singh was forced to grapple with the challenge of handling an external crisis in the midst of a rapidly changing geopolitical and geoeconomic environment. His experience in dealing with the US, Japan, with the US, Japan, and Singapore in particular, and with the Europeans was firmly etched in his memory, and he would often recall events from that period. He had closely bonded with the counterparts in the countries belonging to the Organization of Economic Department, Cooperation and Department, and many of them now in retirement would seek appointments to meet him either in Delhi or in their home capitals whenever Dr. Singh visited them. In his very first budget speech in Parliament in July 1991, Dr. Singh linked India's global standing to the country's economic performance. In doing so, he enunciated a new approach to Indian foreign policy for the post-Cold War era. After spelling out a strategy to deal with an immediate crisis, a balance of payments, and a fiscal crisis, Dr. Singh firmly anchored his economic initiatives in a wider strategic setting, viewing them as foundations for the emergence of India as a major economic power in the world. 6 years later, recalling his speech in an interview published in the inaugural edition of a new international affairs journal, World Affairs, Dr. Singh underlined the foreign policy implications of the new economic policies unveiled by the Narasimha Rao government. There was no doubt in Dr. Singh's mind that the liberalization of the Indian economy was part of the new orientation taken in the context of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of China and the East Asian economies, and India's own economic rise in the 1980s. Indeed, Narasimha Rao himself viewed his foreign policy initiatives in those terms. In one of his first media interviews, Rao told the Sunday magazine in September 1991, now the Cold War is over, there is an element of cooperation instead of confrontation. It is a new situation and we'll have to respond to that. So certain policy orientations will take place to ensure that our national interest does not suffer. In 1991, the national interest was defined essentially in economic terms given the crisis in hand and the need to pull India back from the brink of bankruptcy. However, it was not merely the compulsions of crisis management that forced a rethink on foreign policy priorities. Many economists had anticipated the crisis, and there was a long period of rethinking on economic policy priorities preceding the 1990-1991 crisis. The rethinking was triggered by developmental exercise of East and Southeast Asian economies and that of China, which had launched its own four modernization policy a decade earlier. In the interview he gave me for the Economic Times in February 1991, 3 months before he assumed charge as India's finance minister, Dr. Singh did speak about the relevance of the East Asian growth experience for India and the need to reorient domestic economic policies. He returned to his theme in the last budget speech in February 1995 when he said it is this vision of a resurgent India taking a rightful place as an economic powerhouse in Asia which has inspired our economic policies. In relating India's economic capabilities to its global profile and influence, Dr. Singh was in fact drawing on early Nehruvian realism. In his first major speech on foreign policy, Jawaharlal Nehru told the Constituent Assembly in December 1947. Talking about foreign policies, the House must remember that these are not just empty struggles on a chessboard. Behind them lie all manner of things. Ultimately, foreign policy is the outcome of economic policy, and until India has properly evolved her economic policy, her foreign policy rather will be rather vague, rather inchoate, and will be groping. A vague statement that we stand for peace and freedom by itself has no particular meaning because every country is prepared to say the same thing, whether it means or not. what do we stand for? Well, you will have to develop this argument in the economic field. As it happens today, in spite of the fact that we have been for some time in authority as a government, I regret that we have not produced any constructive economic scheme or economic policy so far. When we do that, that will govern our foreign policy more than all the speeches in this house. He went on to add what can be regarded as an early exposition of Nehruvian realism and said, whatever policy we may lay down, the art of conducting the foreign affairs of a country lies in finding out what is most advantageous to the country. Dr. Singh was guided by this perspective in defining his own worldview. That was a worldview that he chose to express publicly when he addressed the Hindustan Times Leadership Initiative Conference on 5 November 2004. He repeated many of the ideas in that speech at the India Today conclave on 25th February 2005. Taken together, these two were seminal speeches that defined Dr. Singh's view of India's foreign policy. Much thought went into that drafting. I had several sessions with Dr. Singh and he devoted considerable time to reworking successive drafts. These speeches made six significant statements. First, that India's relations with the world, both major powers and Asian neighbors, will be shaped by its own developmental priorities. The single most important objective of India's foreign policy was to create a global environment conducive to her economic development and the well being of the people of India. Second, that India would benefit from a greater integration with the world economy. The world wants India to do well, our challenges are at home, and that India should be closely integrated with other Asian economies as an active member of the future Asian economic community. Third, that India's relations with major powers, especially the United States and more recently China, have increasingly been shaped by economic factors and that our concern for energy security has become an important element of our diplomacy. Fourth, that South Asia's shared destiny required greater regional cooperation, and this would be facilitated by better physical connectivity across the region. Fifth, that India's experiment of pursuing economic development within the framework of plural, secular, and liberal democracy held lessons for the world. As the Prime Minister put it, economists quantify our engagement with the world in terms of our share of world trade and capital flows. Strategic analysts look at military and political alliances. I submit to you for your consideration the idea that the most enduring engagement of a people with the world in the realm of ideas and the idea we must engage the world through is the idea of India, the idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbam, the idea that even as nations may clash, cultures and civilizations can coexist. First, finally, that in a democracy, India had a global responsibility to assist societies in transition. Just as many developed industrial economies assisted the so called economies in transition to make the transition from a centrally planned economies to open market economies, the experience of a democracy like India can be of some help in enabling societies in transition to evolve into open, inclusive, plural, democratic societies. In an earlier comment to Dr. Singh's foreign policy initiatives, the strategic affairs analyst C. Raja Mohan picked these elements and dubbed them the Manmohan Singh Doctrine. Each of these early thoughts began to shape Dr. Singh's foreign policy in the months to come. He was probably the first Indian Prime Minister to unabashedly hold up India's plural, secular, and democratic credentials as worthy foreign policy principles for India's international engagement. In the early post colonial and the long Cold War years, India was more comfortable touting its anti colonial and non aligned and socialist credentials rather than its democratic credentials. Dr. Singh took the UPA's idea of inclusive growth at home to global reforms when he spoke of inclusive globalization. This too was new. Rather than fulminate against globalization as Indian leaders were wont to do, he chose to demand more inclusive structures, arguing that globalization would be a win win process. His interest in regional economic integration with South and Southeast Asia found expression in the movement forward on the South Asian Free Trade Agreement (SAFTA) and the ASEAN India FTA, while the focus on energy security opened the doors to the discussion on the nuclear deal. His foreign policy priorities, driven by the emphasis on India's economic development and regional security, were defined fairly clearly. He sought to improve India's relations with all major powers, especially the US and China, with all of India's economic partners, especially East and Southeast Asian economies, and with India's neighbors. Draft speeches for PM's foreign visits coming from the Ministry of External Affairs invariably had a reference to India's aspiration for UNSC membership. But Dr. Singh's view was that India's economic rise and its regional and global profile would make it impossible for the world community to ignore its legitimate claim when the time would come for UNSC expansion. There was no need, he felt, for India to make a repeated claim each time the PM spoke somewhere. During his first 3 years of UPA1, Dr. Singh referred to the UNSC membership issue only in three occasions: when he addressed the UN General Assembly in 2004 and 5, and when he addressed the US Congress in 2005. It became my job to delete any reference to India's claim for membership of the UNSC each time a draft budget came to the PMO from the MEA. Another phrase that never appeared in Dr. Singh's early foreign policy speeches when was non-alignment. In fact, in September 2006, he actively considered skipping the Havana summit of the non-aligned movement, but came under pressure from his party not to do so. His reason for wanting to stay away from the NAM jamborees was not with what the left and the old world congressmen accused him of, namely a pro-US bias. The truth was that it was not in Manmohan Singh's nature to be hypocritical. He was convinced by K. Subramaniam that the that India's non-alignment was a tactical move by Nehru to avoid getting into Cold War alliances while maintaining good relations with both sides, rather than a pillar of India's grand strategy as it came to be viewed after Indira Gandhi's time. At critical moments when India's own security was threatened, neither Nehru nor Indira hesitated to ally with one side or the other. Nehru tilted towards the US to deal with China in 1962, and Indira entered into a formal alliance with the Soviet Union at the time of Bangladesh War. So India's non-alignment was tactical, not strategic. The best realist interpretation of non-alignment came from a distinguished Polish Marxist economist, Mikhail Kalecki, who worked briefly at the Planning Commission in 1960s and wrote extensively on Third World development. In his famous essay Observations of Social and Economic Aspects of the Intermediate Regimes, an essay that spawned a most fascinating debate between Dr. Singh's friend and the mentor, Professor K. N. Raj, and the Communist Party leader EMS Samudripad in the columns of the Economic and Political Weekly. Kaleki called the non-aligned countries the proverbial clever calves that suck two cows. The, the simultaneous suckling of the two udders, the US and USSR, was a tactical response to an opportunity that presented itself. Given the existing geopolitical environment, a group of countries that Kaleki called the intermediate regimes, neither capitalist nor socialist in the bipolar world, grabbed this opportunity to further their own developmental priorities. In response to criticism at home that Dr. Singh's strategic initiatives with the US constituted a departure from the national consensus on foreign policy, and in effort to outline how India should respond to American overtures, the PM invited K. Subramaniam to head a multidisciplinary task force on US global strategy, emerging trends, and long term implications. The task force submitted its report in June 2006. Among the many issues his report considered was the question of how India should respond to the dynamics of post Cold War balance of power politics. The report's message was simple: the time had come for India to advance its interests through greater integration of the global economy, making the best use of economic opportunities provided by developing countries, especially the US. At, at a ceremony where he laid the foundation stone of the Jawaharlal Nehru Bhavan, the new home of the External Affairs Ministry, in February 2006, Dr. Singh stated the core principles of his foreign policy outlook when he said the objective of Indian foreign policy was to create the space needed to have the freedom to make policy choices in an increasingly independent world, and that policy must evolve from time to time in response to the changing realities of an ever changing world. The emphasis on India's economic interests with other Asian economies and other developing and developed nation economies in shaping India's foreign policy became the leitmotif of Manmohan Singh Doctrine. In October 2005, he told the Combined Commanders Conference, our strategy has to be based on three broad pillars. First, to strengthen ourselves economically and technologically. Second, to acquire adequate defense capability to counter and rebut threats to our security. And third, to seek partnerships both on the strategic front and on the economic and technological front, that widen our policy and development options. The following year, he returned to the Combined Commanders Conference with a formulation relating his thinking on the defense policy to this grand strategy. Our lines of communication, which need to be protected, are today not just the maritime links that carry our foreign trade and vital imports, but include other forms of connectivity with the world. None of this is possible without an active process of security cooperation with like minded nations and littoral countries. When we look at our extended neighborhood, we cannot be struck by the fact that India is the only open, pluralistic, democratic society and rapidly modernizing market economy between the Mediterranean and Pacific. This places a special responsibility upon us, not only in defense of our values but in the search of a peaceful periphery. We have traditionally conceived in our security in extending circles of engagement. Today, whether it's West Asia, the Central Asia, or the Indian Ocean region, there is increasing demand for a political, economic, and defense engagement. Dr. Singh consistently defined India's maritime strategy in terms of growing economic links with its major trading partners, spanning the rim countries of Indian and Pacific oceans. The idea that Indian and Pacific oceans and the region connecting them was an important strategic space for India, given the flow of goods and energy, was implicit in Dr. Singh's view of India's maritime strength. India had, after all, created the Andaman and Nicobar Naval Command to keep an eye on the region and to police it. This thinking, which Dr. Singh strongly endorsed, predated the talk of Indo-Pacific as a region in US strategic discourse. The idea's clearest exposition was, however, made by Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in an address to the Indian Parliament in 2007 when he spoke of the confluence of the two seas. Abe's short-lived tenure delayed the launch of a new strategic engagement with Japan that Dr. Singh wanted to pursue even in UPA 1. Abe's return to power in 2012 revived the energy that the building of closer economic and defense ties with Japan became the only significant foreign policy achievement in UPA 2. Let's take a breather and now continue. It is within this framework of thinking that Dr. Singh situated his initiatives towards India's key partners, the United States, Russia, Japan, the European Union, and ASEAN, and its important neighbors China, Pakistan, and South Asian countries. The Civil Nuclear Energy Cooperation Agreement was not just about India's nuclear weapon status, but was equally important about access to high technology and nuclear energy. On the other hand, the India ASEAN Free Trade Agreement and the South Asian Free Trade Agreement were not just about accessing new markets or opening up one's markets, but about building strategic partnerships and the relations ships of interdependence, as he told Sonia Gandhi in his letter of April 2006. By linking India's geopolitical interests with its economic interests, Dr. Singh defined the new geo-economics of Indian grand strategy. It was easier to explain this to his own party and the wider public in the context of India's relations with the West, especially the US and EU, and its relations with the newly industrializing economies of Asia and the global South. Of course, even in the case of US, there was the baggage of Cold War attitudes and both within India and the US that had to be overcome. The resistance of many in the US State Department and in Washington DC think tank community to President Bush's radical restructuring of India-US relations based on a recognition of India's nuclear status came from those still living in the past, as did the criticism in India that Dr. Singh was taking India into the US camp. However, the real problem in seeking to define Indian foreign policy within its geo-economic perspective arose in defining India's relations with Pakistan and China. India had border problems with both. With Pakistan, the problems were more deep-rooted. Admittedly, there was no simplistic geo-economic solution to either relationship. The point, however, was that increased economic interdependence could open new spaces for diplomacy and high politics. Such interdependence in the case of Dr. Singh had a people to people dimension. Dr. Singh repeatedly defended his initiatives with the US, with China, and with Pakistan within this perspective of people to people and business to business relations, and not just government to government relations. India, he always emphasized, is destined to play a larger role in world affairs, and it must first stabilize its own neighborhood, secure its own borders, and create new interdependencies with countries that matter. He saw a stable South Asian economy as an important basis for India's development. It was in India's interest to resolve long-standing border disputes and the problem of Kashmir. India was doing no one but itself a favor by seeking to resolve these issues. But the Manmohan Singh doctrine was not just about interests devoid of any values. On the contrary, Dr. Singh made bold to impart to the Indian foreign policy new values which were based on India's own cultural inheritance. Rejecting Samuel Huntington's clash of civilizations theory, he repeatedly spoke of India as a symbol of confluence of civilizations and the coexistence of civilizations. He repeated use of the idea of Vasudhaiva Kudambam, the whole world is one family, sought to link this value to India's ancient heritage. But he did not stop with mouthing phrases. He readily agreed to sign on the United Nations Democracy Fund launched by UN Secretary Kofi Annan in 2005, sitting alongside President Bush, and offered Indian professional expertise in conducting elections and the use of electronic voting machines developed by India to countries that sought such assistance. India had rarely identified itself with such democracy related foreign policy initiatives in the Cold War era for fear of offending many third world potentiates. In bold assertion of these values, he asserted in the Lok Sabha in his May 2005 speech our steadfast commitment to democracy, to building a multi ethnic, multi religious, multilingual, multicultural democracy based on respect for fundamental human rights and the rule of law gives us unique place in our era. All nations in the world, I believe, will one day function on those very principles of liberal and pluralistic democracy. This enjoins upon us the obligation to nurture these roots of our nationhood. I commit our government to work earnestly to realize this vision of India's trustworthy destiny. He went to the ASEAN summit, the SAARC summit, the IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, and even the summit of the non-aligned movement with proposals for economic cooperation and defending greater interdependence between nations. Dr. Singh recognizes the single most exception to the world to this worldview on foreign policy is Pakistan. The India-Pakistan relationship stands on completely different footing, unlike even the India-Bangladesh relationship. He recognized that there were limits to the role economic interdependence could play in altering this one relationship. However, even here he was convinced greater interdependence would widen the policy space for normalization of elections. On major policy issues that included relations with the US, China, and Pakistan, Dr. Singh and Natwar came to have similar views, and Natwar increasingly became a source of support for the PM in dealing with the critics within the Congress party. When Natwar had to resign after the Paul Volcker committee's report alleged that both Congress party and he benefited monetarily through deals stuck with Iraq, Saddam Hussein, Dr. Singh was genuinely sorry to see him go. He then took his own time to choose a successor, retaining the portfolio from December 2005 to October 2006 when he handed it over to Pranab Mukherjee. Pranab Mukherjee proved to be a more difficult customer. While Natwar was transparent in his dealings, Pranab was difficult to fathom. For me, two incidents captured this difference. At the end of Dr. Singh's first visit to the UN General Assembly in September 2004, he was to address a press conference. Minutes before the conference began, I received a call from Natwar. Baru, I'm told you have not placed a chair for me at the press conference. I told him that earlier that month, Dr. Singh addressed a press conference at Vigyapan Bhavan, where sat alone in the dais and his colleagues sat in the front row along with the media. That is what I had proposed in the New York press conference too. This is preposterous. You are new, Baru, so you should know this. From the days of Panditji, whenever the Prime Minister of India has met the press at the UN, he has done so with the foreign minister next to him. Tell that to the PM and please let him know that I expect to sit next to him. I promptly conveyed this to Dr. Singh. Mani Dixit, who was present at that time, interjected and said, tell Natwar that the PM will sit alone. Dr. Singh waved to Mani as if to say, let it be, and turned to me and smiled, nodding his head to signal his approval for Natwar to be on the dais with him. Natwar reciprocated the gesture by letting the media know that the PM had excellent meetings with President Bush and Pervez Musharraf. Even though he was not privy to what happened in either meeting, Natwar's public support had its uses. Pranab was never so transparent either in expressing his disagreement or support. After returning from an important visit to Washington DC, Pranab chose not to brief the PM for 3 days. He had gone to see Sonia Gandhi but not had sought an appointment with Dr. Singh. On the third day, I asked Dr. Singh what had transpired at Pranab's meetings with the President Bush and Condoleezza Rice. I don't know, was his plaintive reply. I was taken aback. How could the foreign minister not have briefed the PM immediately on return? I suggested to him that he should summon the foreign minister and demand a briefing. I am not aware of Pranab if Pranab was actually summoned or himself on the time to drop in. But in any event, he visited the PM the next day. Similarly, Pranab would forget to brief the PM on his important meetings with the left. Another curious aspect of his personality was his reluctance to delegate much of his work to his Minister of State Anand Sharma. Sharma would sit in his room in South Block with a clean table in front of him, a diary with no appointments, and bemoaned his marginalization. Pranab routinely declined permissions for Sharma to travel abroad, deputing junior officers to go for some of the meetings. Tell the PM that the External Affairs Ministry is not even allowing me to reply to questions in Parliament, Anand would complain to me. During the debate in Parliament on the nuclear deal, Anand had to lobby to get speaking opportunity and got only one when the PM intervened to suggest that he be allowed to speak. The PM would try to compensate him for this neglect by his immediate boss by occasionally taking him abroad on his visits. When the nuclear deal became a political hot potato for the US, some in the party would brief journalists on the Congress party beat that the party was not keen as a PM on taking this forward. Almost always the reason given would be the so-called minority vote, minority being the euphemism in India for Muslim. When the left and the BJP started raising their pitch and the Congress party remained diffident in extending its support to Dr. Singh, it was finally left to him to defend himself. In fact, fairly early in the game, on his flight to US in July 2005, the mild-mannered Dr. Singh lost his cool when a journalist asked for his response to the criticism that he was deviating from the national consensus of foreign policy by seeking closer relations with the US. He retorted, can you imagine any prime minister consciously or unconsciously selling India? Nobody can sell India. India is not on sale. Nobody has to teach us lessons on patriotism. While he had to battle it out pretty much on his own, when it came to defending the government's engagement with the US, Dr. Singh found wider support within his party on initiatives with China and Pakistan. Everyone welcomed normalization of relations with both the neighbors and the resolution of a border problem. What very few recognized was that any success on any of these two fronts was linked to success on the Western Front. Improved relations with the US were the key to better relations with China, Pakistan, and much of the rest of the world. This simple fact that Subramaniam imagined in Dr. Singh escaped most of Dr. Singh's critique. Ingrained in Dr. Singh escaped most of Dr. Singh's critics. While the key security and foreign policy challenge that Dr. Singh had to deal with in the last months of his first term was the fallout from the Mumbai terror attack of November 2008. It was only fitting that the second major challenge was in a field that he was truly interested in, international economic diplomacy. India's entry into the newly created Leaders Summit of the G20 was a tribute to Indian diplomacy in UPA 1. The G20 was created to offer a portmanteau platform of major economies within which the US and EU could deal with China. When the USSR disintegrated and Russia made peace with the West, the the G7 expanded to include Russia and became G8. Something similar could have happened in 2008 when the US and EU discovered that they would need Chinese cooperation to handle the fallout of the post Lehman transatlantic financial crisis. Indeed, Fred Bernstein at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C., even wrote an essay suggesting that the US and China would come together into a G2 and imagine the global economic slowdown and crisis. President Nicolas Sarkozy of France was horrified. He flew down to Cape David to meet President Bush and suggested that the G20 finance ministers group should meet at the heads of the government state level and discuss the global crisis. Over the previous decade, from 2000 onwards, the G8 would invite several emerging economy leaders to their summit meetings for an outreach meet. The group came to include Brazil, China, India, Mexico, and South Africa. Sarkozy convinced Bush that instead of a G8 plus 5, it might be best to create a new platform under the G20. Bush readily accepted the idea since it was appealing to him that US could deal with China and a larger group that would include Mexico, India, Indonesia, Australia, Saudi Arabia, and other economies. Dr. Singh played an active role in the first two G20 summits in November 2008 and April 2009. The impressive performance of the Indian economy in 2004 to 2008 and its ability to withstand the immediate impact of the Lehman collapse contributed to India's global standing and Dr. Singh's global image. Leaving the London G20 summit in April 2009, President Barack Obama went to Germany where a young school student asked him which politician he admired. Obama's instant reply was that amongst world leaders he admired Dr. Singh of India the most. The robust performance of the economy during UPA-1 provided the policy space within which Dr. Singh could push his ideas on economic interdependence, the irrelevance of borders, and the importance of strategic partnerships defined by economic interests. Subramaniam Task Force also drew pointed attention to the strategic importance of sustained economic growth. The keys to India's tryst with destiny were first, overcoming the challenge of wiping out poverty, ignorance, and disease, as Nehru reminded the nation in 1947, and second, creating a competitive environment that would enable India to rebuild the bridges of mutual interdependence with the world, as Dr. Singh reminded the India Today conclave. In short, India must do what it must at home for it to be able to deal more confidently with the world. That the world believed India was doing in UPA 1. Once the economy began to falter and the government became wobbly, India and SPM lost their sheen, underscoring the fact that the Manmohan Singh doctrine requires as its foundation a rapidly growing and dynamic economy capable of overcoming domestic challenges, facing international competition, and being engaged with the global economy. With this, we come to the end of chapter 8. Uh, this chapter is primarily about the Manmohan Singh Doctrine, which is a set of 6 steps asserting the position of India. Before Manmohan, in much early years of India's post post independent India's strategic alliances with the world was based on the non-aligned movement, which is India would not get involved in any other country's alignments. It kept an equidistant with USSR and US in the Cold War years, and this was a strategic decision that Nehru took. Sanjaya feels that Nehru took it not just because he wanted to keep equidistance, uh, but it was he did it because it was convenient for the Indian economy to do so at that point of time. He, however, he says that this was tactical and not strategic, and that when the time came, India took the help of US against China, and so this was not a non-aligned movement, was not a broad strategic thought for India. It was a tactical move for India to keep an equidistant and take opportunities as they came. And therefore, Dr. Manmohan Singh was reluctant to attend the non-aligned movement summits. He would participate in the UN General Assembly, and he made grand speeches. He got a lot of good support with somebody who he felt would have been a strong contender for the prime minister, and therefore his political rival within the Congress party, Natwar Singh. Um, he befriended Natwar Singh, and that kind of helped him in the coming years. Uh, Natwar Singh also started seeing value in working for Dr. Manmohan Singh. However, after the Walker report came out, Natwar Singh had to be removed from his post, and that kind of hurt Manmohan Singh. Also, he felt that he was losing a good asset from his finance ministry. Finance ministry was something was again a ministry that was close to Manmohan Singh because he felt that this was a ministry where he could assert himself. He had a lot of experience working in Geneva. He had good relations with people who mattered. These are people who would come to India seeking an appointment with Manmohan Singh to meet him, or whenever he visited state capitals of the world, they would seek appointments to meet him. So therefore, he had the connections and he had the network of people with knowledge on the subject. Uh, what else is there in this chapter? Yeah, so there is this whole underlining of the 6 steps of the Manmohan Singh doctrine. I'm not going to go through them because I don't remember them. I can't find them right now here, but it's something that you can read about. He also started asserting himself in some decisions which uh, were against what he was advised by the foreign ministry. For example, when Reagan died, he was told not to go to the Roosevelt House and offer his condolences. Instead, that the condolence book would be brought to him. So this is when he was a little confused because he felt that he should go and that would send the right message. And his ministry told him not to do so. So he discussed about it with Sanjaya Baru, and Sanjay Baru reminded him about how Jawaharlal Nehru would himself go to uh, the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador's place, and have meetings there. And in fact, there is a space where Nehru used to have his tea and meet, and that space is earmarked and has become legendary in the US ambassador's place. And so he does go against the advice of his foreign affairs ministry and takes his own decisions. What else is there in this chapter that I can talk about? uh, Oh, yeah, I can find out about the 6 statements which were called the Manmohan Singh Doctrine. First was about India's relationship with the world, both major powers and Asian neighbors. So it's a combination of India's relationship with US, China, other major powers, the European countries, and its immediate neighbors, which is China, Pakistan, and South Asian countries. Secondly, that India would benefit from the greater integrations with world economy, because the world wants India to do well. Because if India does well, the world does well. The economies of the world do better if India does well. Third is India's relations with major powers, especially US and China, has been increasingly shaped of economic factors. Economic factors uh, would drive the relations between major countries. India was emerging as one of the largest economies, and therefore it was important that the relationship between India and US, India and China are based on economic factors. What are the other points? Then there are points about the South Asia's shared destiny. Uh, yeah, fifth is also in a way repeating about India's experiment with pursuing economic development within the framework of plural, secular, liberal democracy. Yes, India could be a way, or India could guide the rest of the world who want to get into uh, to becoming robust, powerful democracies. Okay, I'm going out of the 6 doctrines and leading to this subject, which I found interesting, which is India could guide many countries who wanted to become robust democracies by uh, sharing the India experience of doing elections, free and fair elections, having a commission, having ballot sheets, and the entire process of handling an election in a democracy. So that could be the learning that the world could gain out of India, India being the largest democracy in the world. uh, what else is there in this chapter to unravel? I think, yeah, I've covered everything. I've also covered the important point that India was not an important part of the non-aligned movement because it was strategic need. It was more a tactical need. Uh, there is emphasis on India's guarding the the Indian Ocean region, because India had its assets in Andaman and Nicobar where it could survey or do a surveillance of the of that, what do you call it, uh, uh, of the countries that are there. Basically, the trade route which goes to China and comes back, they have an eye on that. What else? What else? Yeah, I think I've covered most of whatever I could remember. There's a lot based also or spoken about how when Natwar Singh left, Pranab Mukherjee came in, and Pranab Mukherjee was far more guarded. Pranab Mukherjee was not as open as Natwar Singh was, and to the extent that he would go and attend meetings with Bush and Condoleezza Rice and not come to, when on his return to India, not meet the Prime Minister for 3 or 4 days to debrief on what happened. Um, yeah, that's about it. So that's it from this chapter. Again, I am learning a lot from this book. While it is verbose and it's a little difficult to read at times, I keep yawning in between. It is an interesting experience for me to learn, understand, see what work goes behind, what thought processes are involved, the the depth in which people at that level need to think and work and weigh their options and weigh the pros and cons. Uh, I hope you are also enjoying listening to the book. Do drop your comments, your suggestions, your likes, dislikes, anything that you want me to change, and I would be happy to do so. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Bye.